finally, they went back for that little Cation kitty and he's getting rescued. It's so adorable. Oh my god. Hello, interwebs, and welcome to my review of the penultimate episode of this batch of episodes of Season 1 of Star Trek Prodigy, called A Moral Star Part 1. As per usual, I'll do my spoiler-free thoughts up front, and then we'll get into spoilers, but I have to honestly just say to all of you, I'm a little bit frustrated that, as I mentioned, this is the penultimate episode of this kind of like pod of episodes that we've gotten for Star Trek Prodigy, because we are going to get 10 more episodes of Season 1 sometime later this year, probably towards the summer, I think they announced, and then Season 2 after that. But I'm really frustrated that we're only getting 5 episodes, because with this episode, I can confirm that this show has finally started to really click with me, and I am super invested in it. It took a little bit longer for me to warm up to this show than I normally would, and I think that's a little bit of my like high expectations that I had for the show going into it. It was honestly the show that I was most excited for when I heard about it way back when it was announced. And I was taking a little bit of time to warm up to it as a result. Like episodes 2 through 6 or so, I was kind of just a little bit like treading water with it. But 7, 8, and now 9 have all shown to me that this show is truly something special, because this episode is, again, firing on all cylinders in all the ways that I've wanted this show to do and to go. We're really starting to see with this episode a real focus on this, cast of characters finally becoming a crew, quite literally getting, the Starfleet uniforms in the background, but they're all starting to click together as a unit. And while I certainly like the dysfunctional family member plot that we see in shows like Farscape and things like that, and it has worked before in Star Trek, and actually should have been a greater part of other Star Trek shows like Star Trek Voyager, for example, should have had even more conflict among the crew, I wasn't really gelling with that dynamic as much in earlier seasons. It didn't work for me as much as I would have hoped it would have. And so now that we're getting to this point in the show where all these characters are clicking together, I'm really feeling it. And this really works in this episode, because you start to see them all gelling in their own relationships with each other as a crew. And while I still think there's some more relationships that we could see a little bit more of, like Jenkem hasn't gotten a ton of stuff this season yet. But what else I liked about this episode was it finally showed the character growth that all of these characters have been going through this season come out in full force here. Dahl finally is a great captain character. He's really showing his growth as a captain and dealing with situations with that sort of captain's poise, but still a kid and still learning, obviously. But Gwen is also learning to relate to others, to have empathy for others, and to connect with family around her. And I think all of that's great. And then all the other characters in this episode, while they don't have like great character moments like Dahl and Gwen do, they do at least all get moments to shine within this episode, and I really appreciated that. And then from there, as this being like a part 1 of a kind of a pseudo mid-season finale that we've got going on here, this episode's starting to really address some of the bigger storylines, like the characters going to confront the diviner and dealing with that situation. And again, a little bit more hints of the backstory going on that we'll be talking about in just a minute in the spoiler-filled section. And it led to a really action-filled, like, fun plot with a couple twists and turns that I kind of saw coming personally, but for a kid's show, I don't really expect it to be the twistiest of twisty plots. For a show of this level, I think it was like a solid twist and turn and a really solid storytelling for not to, like, this isn't saying like, oh, it's a kid's show, it can be dumber. My point more is like, this was a really solid like story structure that for me was a little bit predictable, but was solidly executed and exciting to watch. I'm not looking down on kid shows by any means, but for it's just a plot that works really well, and they effectively told it, and I had a lot of fun within it, and it fit these characters well, while also fitting the larger tension and mysteries of the show. So going down to end out my spoiler-free thoughts, like I said, I am just frustrated because this show is really starting to find its momentum, I feel, right now, and I'm really invested in it. And as much as I'm excited to get more Star Trek Discovery and then, Picard and Strange New Worlds on the slightly more distant but fairly close horizon, I'm going to be really disappointed to see Prodigy go for a little while, because I'm just now like really feeling like the show is hitting its full steam ahead, and I'm kind of saddened that it's going to have to halt next week, but at least we get one more episode before we get there. With all that being said, though, it is time for my spoiler-filled thoughts, so if you haven't seen the episode, you can jump away, and I will see you next week. So getting a spoiler-filled thoughts, I really love the opening of this episode with the characters all around Rock Talk, and Rock Talk sort of telling what her journey was and what was going on last time in Time Amok, her being stuck in that little time bubble that she was in. and everyone's sort of like feeling like, yeah, we are a crew, even though we were separated, we work together, and they're kind of like riding high on that crew dynamic, and it was just really nice to see. And then we have an immediate sort of tension in that, because the Deadlock's body that we saw printed at the end of last episode sends out a message from the diviner, who basically says, progeny, come back to me. And by the way, can this dude stop saying progeny? My progeny, my progeny, my progeny. He just says it like every other word, and it drives me bonkers a little bit. But I guess the show's name is Prodigy, so kind of similar. But regardless, he also says that if they don't return the Protostar, he will kill all the miners, the unwanted, which is a great name for them, by the way. I don't remember if I caught that way back in the pilot, but they probably were called that then, but I just caught that now. I was like, that's a great name for how the diviner would think about them, the unwanted. Very on the nose, but kind of points to like the more political undertones of what they were trying to do with the diviner way back in the pilot episode, which was kind of interesting to see of his thought process on these people that they want to rescue. And so he says, either you return me the Protostar or I'll kill all the miners. And so this creates an interesting debate amongst the crew, basically like being like, well, we have to save these miners either way. Do we go back and try and save them ourselves because we know we have time to do that and sacrifice the ship in order to save them? Or do we go and head to the Federation and hopefully the Federation can come save them, but we don't know for sure if they'll get there in time. This sparks the debate between all the crew, and I like that Janeway sort of says that, the decision falls upon Dal. Now, there is an interesting question here about like why Dal is the one that gets to make this choice. I know that he is the captain of this crew, and definitely this show is trying to set up that like Starfleet-esque structure, but for me, I'm sort of like, he just kind of imposed the captain's role upon himself, and I know that they're building him up to be the leader of this group, but it still feels weird to me that they're not like more democratized at this point with these characters, that they're all like, yeah, no, Dal can make the choice. Or at least I would have rather the characters kind of like have stated that as like, well, we'll all turn to you, Captain, because it's kind of stated by Janeway that like Captain makes the choice. And honestly, I guess what I'm thinking as I'm talking this out is I really feel more like that sentence should have come from the crew. Like everyone was bickering amongst themselves, and then they all kind of turned to Dal for the final decision, and that's where he walks away. So I appreciate them trying to set this up from Janeway and her giving the advice and her being the mentor, but I actually would have rather seen that dynamic of them like looking to him for advice come from them rather than Janeway. Just a small tweak to the scene that did kind of frustrate me a little bit, but that did lead to probably the best scene of the episode for me, which is when Dal walks away and Gwen follows him, and Gwen sort of calls him out. It's like, you're being selfish, you need to make this choice. And he said, well, he basically comes down to like, I don't want to lose you guys. It's my responsibility to take care of these people, take care of this crew. The most Star Trekian of Star Trek things to think of as a captain. You care for your crew, and then you care for others as well. And that sort of conflict always coming up in debate, like, who do you care for more? Most Starfleet captains would put their crew at risk, but these are people who aren't Starfleet officers. So he has to keep that in mind, that they're just sort of there by circumstance. And so I really appreciate Dal sort of going on that journey to really be thinking of others when he was a very selfish character. And so I liked that we're starting to see him become more selfless. And I really like Gwen sort of talking to him and saying, like, we are connection, we are family, we are crew, we can do this together. Sort of showing her growth, being like a loner as well, and sort of finding a found family here. So that was probably, I think, the emotional core of this episode for me that I really enjoyed. But obviously we have the crew going on to save the miners. They're not heading to the Federation just yet, though I hope we will get to see the Federation of whatever era this is. Again, I'm still expecting some sort of time travel shenanigans going on here, so I'm curious to see where the Federation's at, given what we know of the wonky timeline of this series so far. But regardless, they go and fight the diviner, and basically they decide to give up the ship, and they have this whole montage to go do that, and they sort of get together as a crew. It's really fun, and they get new Starfleet uniforms, which look rather sexy. I'm not as big a fan of these uniforms. Again, I'm never the biggest fan of the mostly gray kind of look. They did the same sort of thing in Star Trek Discovery Season 3, where it was like a mostly gray uniform with pops of color. And if you look here, honestly, they have little pops of color showing their ranks, but it's very subtle on the brim. You can't even really see it in this image. But you got to see like the reds and yellows and blues, but it's not very pronounced. And so I just don't really love the gray with subtle hints of color. I think the only time that super worked for me was in Deep Space Nine and Star Trek First Contact. And then I guess Insurrection as Nemesis as well. I think that one kind of looked nice. But beyond that, I like the more poppy, colorful Starfleet uniforms, in my opinion. Not bad looking, though. I like the design here. It's better than Disco Season 3, but not my personal favorite. But it looks pretty solid, to my mind. Regardless, though, they put all the uniforms on. They're a team. They go and confront the diviner, and they basically give up the ship. And there's a good little scene between Gwen and the diviner, basically, where the diviner's like, I care about you. I want you to come with me. That's part of my deal. And Gwen's like, I'm with these people now. And him sort of like having this sort of like, I want you with me, this sort of possessive. He still views her more as an object rather than more of an extension of himself, his progeny, rather than anything with a will of her own. And so again, you still see this sort of sense of possessiveness, even though he does have a sense of caring for her. It's more of an extension of self. And I thought that was like a cool little thing to sort of glean from his character in this episode. But he does have a profound regret, as we later learn, that he gave up Gwen for the Protostar earlier on in this series. So I like that coming back around and Gwen sort of calling him out on it. Also, we get to see the little kitty, the little Cation kitty come back again that I joked about earlier, which was adorable to see her, and sort of gave us a minor to worry about in this situation, because otherwise it's just been a bunch of faceless people. So that we now have this little Cation, we at least have like an investment in these miners as like a face to them, which was a clever, subtle seeding for the writers to sort of place that kitty there to make us instantly care about these miners in a very coded way, because everyone cares about a little adorable kitty. The diviner gives them his ship, and they they leave in the Protostar, and then he blows up their power reserves, betraying them, leaving them to die without gravity, and all sort of trying to return the gravity as fast as he can, but sort of dealing with everything that's going on there. But then we also have Gwen sort of asking questions of the diviner and basically trying to figure out like a little bit more of this backstory that's being hinted at, because he's hinting at the fact that this Protostar is something that will save his entire civilization. So considering they are supposed to be the last of their race, I'm curious what the Protostar can do. Again, I'm thinking maybe time travel. He's going back in time to try and save his people. Obviously, also, he has a little bit of a grudge against Starfleet for some reason, so I wonder if Starfleet is the reason for his people's death. Might be an interesting sort of thing to think about as we go into the rest of this season. That's sort of my curious thoughts on the sort of background hinted at here. We also get Janeway being turned into evil hologram Janeway, which is cool to see, but then eventually the diviner realizes that Gwen is stalling, so that the crew can actually try to, they actually have the Protostar drive, and they have probably a bigger plan as well, but we don't know what it is yet. So they have a plan, and I love the fact that they hid the Protostar drive inside of Murph, who is indestructible, which can hold that star. Very, very cool. Like a clever conceit, and they hid Murph inside of Zero's outfit. Super, super clever. I thought that again, they seeded all these things, that Murph is indestructible and things like that. I guess Murph can hold a frickin' sun, which is kind of crazy to think about, but regardless, I think it is a really clever use of that concept. And again, Murph being very OP as a character in this show, but again, nice seeding throughout. And so, yeah, that leads us into part 2, where the crew is some sort of plan that they're going to enact to defeat the diviner and rescue the miners and hopefully get the Protostar back. So I'm very excited. As I said, this episode was extremely solid. I am really feeling this series now. I feel like it's really started to pick up. And while I have some nitpicks here and there of a bunch of different episodes, this is another, I feel, strong episode of this series. And I am so excited to see where this mid-season finale is going to leave us next week before we get back to Star Trek Discovery. But until then, I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. Leave me a comment, and don't forget to like and subscribe as well. Also, I have my main channel, Jessie Gender, where I do video essays and things like that. But beyond all of that, I just hope that you, as always, live long and stay sexy, my friend.